Ukraine and the Dark Legacy of World War II. In this video, I'm going to talk about the legacy of World War II and how a persistent invocation of the trauma of World War II provides a very strong, irrational, and highly emotional motivation for wars. How this applies to Ukraine and what we should do, both the U.S. and Russia and Ukraine, as quickly as possible to avert thermonuclear war. As I speak, the United States and Russia are engaged in their closest and most extreme direct military confrontation ever, with many tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of soldiers and civilians who have already died in the Ukraine. This is much worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which one U.S. pilot, U-2 pilot, was shot down. Shown here on the right is the explosion of the Castle Bravo, one of the first deliverable hydrogen bombs in the world in the 1950s. This device could produce the yield equivalent to 15 million tons of TNT. That's about 1,000 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which killed about 100,000 people in each city. If one of these bombs were to be dropped on a major population center like Moscow or New York City or Beijing or the Bay Area where I live, it would kill millions upon millions of people. The destruction would extend for many, many miles. Both the United States and Russia have something on the order of 1,000 of these devices on intercontinental ballistic missiles and airplanes, submarines, etc. We're probably the closest to a thermonuclear war in history. And the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists agrees. They recently moved their so-called doomsday clock 90 seconds to midnight, where midnight represents global thermonuclear war and the possible extermination of the human race. The Bulletin was founded by Albert Einstein and other concerned scientists in the 1940s, at which time they put the clock at 7 minutes to midnight. 90 seconds is the closest it's ever been put to midnight, ever, even worse than during the height of the Cold War. Most wars are shades of gray, the products of miscalculations, egos, arrogance, ambition, stupidity, sheer errors. They are horrific and often end badly for all sides, with huge losses of life and great regret. Nearly everyone in the world today remembers World War I this way, the bad war. Nobody wants to repeat World War I, and it's seen in retrospect, probably correctly, as a great and horrific mistake. But at the time, people saw it as a battle of good and evil. In the West, in the United States, it became us versus the Huns, the evil Germans. And in Germany, the Germans were fighting for Christian Germany, etc. Everybody thought they were the good guys. But there is an exception, a good war, World War II. And this is largely due in modern consciousness to the mass murders, the genocides and so forth perpetrated by Nazi Germany in particular in Eastern Europe. This is the archetype, the template for Star Wars, the evil empire that destroys an entire planet, killing billions of people with a superweapon, the Death Star. World War II is the good war. And no one, or at least publicly, would admit that they want anything like this evil empire to return. And that provides a never-ending excuse for war after war after war in the modern world. I'm going to talk about that more. Part of the history, and maybe the mythology, of World War II is the Munich Agreement of 1938. In September of 1938, rising Germany under Adolf Hitler demanded sovereignty over the Sudetenland. So at the end of World War I, the victorious British, French, with the apparent acquiescence of the U.S. and Woodrow Wilson, imposed an extremely vindictive peace treaty, the Versailles Treaty, on Germany and the defeated powers, breaking up Germany, slicing off pieces of it, and creating, in particular, a country called Czechoslovakia by pushing together Germans, who are shown in blue here. These are German-speaking areas, the Sudetenland, along the Sudeten Mountains between Czechoslovakia and Germany. There were also Czechs in what is now the Czechia and was Czechoslovakia. They also cobbled together the Slovaks in the eastern area here. This is now a separate country, Slovakia. And in fact, this tiny country also had Hungarian speakers and some Polish speakers and some Ukrainian speakers. So it was a nightmare. No one of these groups actually had a majority, although the Czechs dominated the government. There was all kinds of friction and fighting among the different groups. And the Sudeten Germans were undoubtedly mistreated by the Czech government. And Nazi Germany, having taken over several other German-speaking areas like Austria, often with strong support of the people in those areas, presented itself as the protector of the Sudeten Germans, who had legitimate grievances against the government. And Germany, up until this time, was always presenting itself as seeking a greater Germany, the great pan-German ambition of unifying the German-speaking peoples. An understandable idea, and one which was many people were sympathetic to, even if they otherwise disagreed with policies of Germany or the Nazi movement. Hitler and Nazi Germany threatened war over the treatment of the people in the Sudeten Germany. In many respects, there's a lot of similarity between this and the current crisis in Ukraine, where Russia is acting as a protector of the Slavs, and specifically the Russian-speaking Slavs, who make up a majority in some parts of Ukraine, which are the areas Russia has successfully occupied so far. So what happened? Well, people really didn't want to repeat World War I. It had been a terrible disaster. Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich, Germany, and he and the French leader Daladier and others met with Hitler in person, and they negotiated an agreement, the Munich Agreement, in which Germany would become the sovereignty, would take over basically the Sudetenland. In principle, leaving alone the Czech areas, the Slovak areas. And that sort of held for 6 months. All right, and Chamberlain was widely praised for this successful avoiding of a Second World War. But it didn't work out so well. In March of 1939, 6 months later, Slovakia broke off under a pro-German government, a fascist or quasi-fascist government. And at about the same time, like the next day or whatever, Germany somehow got itself invited in to take over what is now Czechia. This is the provinces of Moravia and Bohemia, and German tanks rolled into Prague and they took over. Now, we today see this as imperialism. I'm sure the Germans had some sort of high-minded, altruistic sounding excuse, how they were probably intervening in Czechoslovakia to stop the fighting among the Slovaks and Czechs, or some excuse like that, I'm sure, as we often hear in many wars and conquests throughout history. So after that, Germany started to do the same thing in Poland a little while later. So again, in Poland, just as in Czechoslovakia, there were German-speaking minority groups, or they weren't minorities in certain regions, along the border with Germany. Again, parts of Germany have been yanked off from Germany under the Treaty of Versailles. And so again, Germany came in and said, yeah, we just want to protect the German-speaking people. We want access to the German city of Danzig, and so on. So again, sort of reasonable, but now there was this example that they had taken over Czechoslovakia, the non-German speaking areas in Czechoslovakia. This time, Chamberlain and the French government drew the line in Poland. They declared war on Germany when Russia actually invaded Poland. And Germany actually took about a third of Poland, and Russia took the more Slavic parts under Stalin. That decision to draw the line in Poland actually was disastrous. Germany quickly overran France, conquered France, completely crushed them. The British forces had to flee at Dunkirk to Great Britain, to the UK, where they were besieged from the air by massive bombardments, the Battle of Britain. And Britain most likely would have gone down had it not been for two things. One, Hitler and Stalin eventually turned on each other. And secondly, the United States, through various questionable and sometimes illegal methods, got itself into the war and came to Britain's assistance. But had that not happened, or it's taken longer, there are many scenarios under which the result of this decision to draw the line at Poland would have ended with Britain conquered or completely neutralized by a Russian and German alliance. Nonetheless, the way Munich is always taught to people, and at least for me here in the United States, and I believe around the world, is only Neville Chamberlain and the French guy Daladier had drawn the line at the Sudetenland and said, no, you can't have the Sudetenland, you awful people. We know you're going to go out there and slaughter millions of people, so we're going to draw the line here, even though the Sudeten Germans have various legitimate grievances. That's completely unclear. It could have worked out similar to what happened with Poland, with France overrun. France thought it had very good defenses, but it didn't, and they were crushed by the German tank forces and so forth. So in war after war, specifically this Munich confrontation and more general the horrors of World War II are invoked. And an important point here is we have a situation where Germany had a legitimate case regarding the mistreatment of Germans in the Sudetenland. There was strong support in the Sudetenland from the German-speaking people there for merging with Germany. And so we can make an analogy between this in almost any situation where someone brings up some issue, whether it's mistreatment of an ethnic minority or security concerns like the many concerns Russia has expressed about the expansion of NATO and the possibility of Ukraine becoming part of NATO forces getting closer and closer to their border. Any kind of situation like that can be analogized, and an analogy can be made to Munich, to the Nazis, and their concerns dismissed, and, this mass murder, these horrible things the Nazis did, can be invoked to sort of dismiss any concerns and treat this crisis or situation as an existential fight for survival against genocide. Munich has been the excuse for war that never ends. It was invoked by the U.S., and the Nazis in general were invoked by the communists in Korea, in Vietnam. Remember, each side is saying, we're fighting the Nazis, we are doing what Neville Chamberlain should have done in Munich, we are drawing the line here, and we're going to fight to the last citizen, to the last person, because we are fighting the genocidal Nazis. It happened in El Salvador in Central America in the 80s when I was a younger person. And it happened with both of the wars in Iraq, time and time again. This analogy to the Nazis, to World War II, and to the Munich Agreement frequently is invoked. It's sort of like going through a trauma as a child and constantly repeating it in your mind and in your actions as you get older, rather than moving past the trauma. What are we doing in the Ukraine? It's really hard to see what the strategy here is, what the goal is here. It looks like the United States is trying to bleed Russia, wear it down, and change the government, take over the government, oust Vladimir Putin, have somebody assassinate Putin, something like that. And people have called for this, of course, some U.S. senators and others. Well, let's keep in mind, the end of the Cold War was an exceptional event, almost unprecedented in human history. Russia was not defeated, or the Soviet Union was not defeated on the battlefield. They weren't defeated at all. They joined with the United States to make changes. They withdrew from Eastern Europe. They tore down the Berlin Wall. Both countries agreed to send arms inspectors, physical people, to inspect the nuclear weapons capabilities of the others, not relying on satellites or airplanes or things like that, so that they could really enforce agreements to scale back their nuclear arsenals, which they did not eliminate, however. That is not military victory, and it's unprecedented, if not unprecedented, extremely rare in human history for countries to settle their differences in this way. To think that we can predictably repeat this, which is rarely if ever happened in human history, now, by bleeding Russia, is gambling with thousands of nuclear weapons, gambling with the lives of millions and millions of people all over the world. It's time to talk. We shouldn't be relying on inept politicians. Write to President Biden. Write to your senators, your congressmen. Make your feelings known. It is time to talk. It is time to scale back this crisis. Well, what about the analogy to Munich? What if we allow Russia to take over the Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine? That seems a very likely outcome and very likely supported by many majorities of people in many of the, if not all of the Russian-speaking areas in Ukraine. What about that Sudeten analogy? Good fences make good neighbors. If we can spend $100 billion on offensive weapons to kill people with no peace in sight, with no negotiations in sight, we can spend $100 billion, $200 billion, whatever, for defensive fortifications and other measures to place a wall between the Ukrainians and the Russians that will protect both sides, that will allow both of them to be confident that they will not be attacked. Now, sure, I'm not a military expert, and there may be many adjustments to some sort of plan like this, but let's remember, good fences make good neighbors. And that's the basis for not setting yourself up for a subsequent reinvasion by Russian forces from the Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine, as disastrous as that surely would be for Russia, and similarly to provide security to Russia and the Russian-speaking people, that they also are protected for an unwarranted attack. But whatever you think the specific terms of the negotiated arrangement be, it is time to talk. And it's time for the public not to accept vague statements from Joseph Biden, our president, or Anthony Blinken, or the Victoria Nuland, or these other people who seem to be running this inexplicable policy of nuclear confrontation with the only other major nuclear power in the world. No, we need to speak up and let them know it's time to talk. They need a convincing plan to eliminate this risk of global thermonuclear war as soon as possible. This concludes this video presentation. If you like this video, please click like. Please click subscribe and the notification bell if you would like to receive more content from us. You can avoid internet censorship by subscribing directly to our RSS news feed. Please consider sharing the link by email and on your website or blog, in addition to liking, upvoting, or sharing on increasingly censored, advertising beholden, big company social media. We have encountered such censorship. Mathematical software is developing algorithms and software to automate data analysis, reducing the risks of costly errors and increasing the predictive power of the results. You can support our work financially by subscribing on our Patreon page, https://www.patreon.com/mathsoft, or scanning the QR code in the lower right corner.